Hey everyone, welcome. If we haven't met before, my name is Rebecca. I'm a book coach and developmental editor. And every week I like to meet you here to answer questions that come from my community members, my group coaching clients, and from people who watch these YouTube videos regularly. This week's question comes from a writer in my self-editing essentials group coaching program. She is getting ready to write a book series, and she had a question that I thought would be of interest to a lot of writers who are interested in doing something similar. She asks, my book will have a sequel or two. What kind of forethought do you think we should have when working in a series? This is such an important question because as writers, we tend to overthink things a little bit. And thinking about writing a book is hard enough, right? Thinking about writing an entire series is enough to make our brains hurt. So, what I want to do today is just really talk about the basics. What is it that you absolutely need to think about when you are launching a series, when you are starting to think about creating a series of stories, and what we can kind of put on the back burner and not worry about in the beginning? So, we're going to talk about how to plan ahead without overloading your first book and also without overthinking your entire series, too. So, we're going to determine what we want to plan for now and what can really wait until later. We don't need to do everything in book one, and we shouldn't. We're going to talk about how to plant natural, seamless hints that keep the reader interested and will inspire them to keep reading. And we're going to talk about how to keep each book satisfying on its own. When agents are looking at series books, they are looking for books that if your reader suddenly came in at book three, they'd have a pretty good idea of what was going on. They would be able to catch up. They're also looking for books that are standalone in the sense that they are going to be satisfying, even if the reader never reads anything else that you write. I mean, we hope that doesn't happen. Obviously, each of these books is a seed you're sowing to get them to the next story as well. But we want our readers to feel satisfied with each independent book. So we'll talk about how to make that happen. So the elements of a successful series are really kind of simple if you think about it. They ask a very compelling long-term question, and the whole series is worth sticking with because it's that series that's going to answer the large question. We also see in a series compelling characters who are usually rather complex, and we're going to watch them grow. We're going to watch them evolve. So if you think about a standalone book, the characters that we really tend to fall in love with and care about the most often have to face big obstacles. They change. They're not flat character arcs. We want the same thing for a series. The character is going to start out in book one very different, most likely, than they do in book three. Now, that's not always true. We have flat character arcs like Sherlock Holmes or Miss Marple, right? And these characters are by design flat arcs, perfectly fine, particularly in mystery or detective kind of series. But oftentimes our character is going to evolve as that series goes along. So we want to think about their character arc in that context. And finally, we want a world that can really expand with each book. With each book, we learn more about the particulars of that specific world that you're building. So, a really popular series that a lot of us will be familiar with is The Hunger Games. In this series, it's asking the question, will Katniss survive and make a difference in a society that's ruled by oppression? So while each book throws different obstacles at this protagonist in different ways, there is this overarching question that we are seeking an answer to if we stick with reading the entire trilogy. So, the two arcs that you really want to be planning for when you think about a series is first the series arc, right? That overarching transformation, the mystery, the conflict, whatever it is that your characters are going to be encountering. And we want a clear destination. This is going to be so helpful for you as you write your way forward, is if you know the end results that you are hoping to take these characters on. Having your eye on that destination lets you know everything that needs to happen beforehand. That's not to say you need to know every single detail. You will go bananas trying to map out all the different plot points for an entire series. It just means that you know that you are going to need particular plot points that are able to be constructed to get you to that place. The second arc that you need to plan for is the book arc. Again, each book needs to be an independent story that readers could pick up and have a complete experience with. So we want to know that your book has a beginning, middle, and an end, and that the arc gives your reader emotional satisfaction and feelings of closure. So we're going to go back to our example of the Hunger Games and talk about what these different arcs look like within the context of this series. So when we think about the series, we are thinking about character arcs, thematic arcs, and narrative arcs. These are the three kinds of arcs that every story needs to track. So it determines the beginning, middle, and end of your character's development, the themes you're exploring, and the story you're telling. So, in the instance of character arcs, Katniss evolves from a survival-focused teenager who's just kind of trying to get through things to a very reluctant leader and hero and somebody who represents change. We don't see all of this in book one. The beauty of the trilogy is that we get to see this character develop slowly and in meaningful ways. And so in many ways, a series can be so profoundly powerful because we're with these characters for such a long time. And so throughout, we watch this character Katniss evolve in this way. The thematic arc of this series is the exploration of an oppressive government. And we're looking at the ethics involved with violence and media manipulation. What is the difference between personal and societal responsibility? We're looking at some really big questions that, again, can be explored in such a more thorough way when we look at it over time. So again, these are great questions to be looking at in a series. And finally, we have the narrative arc, from personal survival to political awakening to revolution and resolution. We see how the society is shifted by the actions of the characters in the story and of the consequences of their actions. I just thought about the series arcs, right? We've thought about this very big picture overview of how the different arcs in these stories are going to evolve. When we think about the first book and we think about the function of its arcs, we can think about it this way. What the book needs to do first is establish the premise that's going to drive this entire series forward. So in the instance of the Hunger Games, Katniss is volunteering to take her sister's place in the Hunger Games, which, if you haven't read the book, it's this brutal televised event in which horrible things happen. We're focusing, or the character is focusing primarily on survival. It's just getting through this horrible situation that they find themselves in. And this first book is also beginning to introduce very compelling characters who are going to be very important in terms of Katniss's empowerment and in terms of helping her survive and ultimately evolve into the character that she becomes by the time you see her in book three, right? So this first book is really getting everything set up so that we understand the stakes, we understand the obstacles, maybe some of the goals. We're just getting the reader situated. And finally, it's setting up this very oppressive society so that we can understand those stakes and we can start to believe in the story. This is where the story begins to feel real, is in book one. Okay, so now I want to zoom back and start thinking about you, the writer. How much do you need to know in advance before you begin writing your series? Well, like I said when we opened here, you are going to want a certain amount of clarity because it's just going to make the work so much easier. If you can see that finish line and you know what you're running toward, obviously it's a lot easier to plan for that. But that does not mean you want to get bogged down this early on in plot points that are very complicated and, likely to change. I see too many writers get really hung up on all the granular details and they really lose sight of the big picture. And you want your eye on the big picture when you're at these early stages of planning a series. So clarity, but not fully plotted details. So you're planning for the emotional or plot destination of the series, that finish line. You're thinking about the main, and this is very important. You want to think about what the turning point is between each of the books, right? So again, not this doesn't need to be weighed down in heavy plot points, but you would probably benefit from having one or two sentences jotted down in your journal or in an outline of some sort that reminds you of what that shift is for the next book. Why does that next book need to be? And thinking about characters who are going to grow, how they're going to evolve, and when they might drop off in the series. Not every character that you start with needs to be in your last book. So you may start to think about which characters appear in which book. That can be helpful as well. And I also really encourage you to think about the world that you're building. Think about what elements your readers need to know right away and save the rest for later because that world building is magical to readers. They love learning about all the little granular details in your characters' lives. And if we dump them all in the beginning, that's not going to make for a very satisfying read over the long haul. So save some of that magic for later on. Just give them what they need, what the reader needs at each point in order to fully appreciate the world that you are constructing. Can't say this enough. Don't overstuff book number one. Book number one needs to be comprehensive. It needs to have everything that all the elements that a satisfying book contains, but we don't need to have every idea you've ever had for this series dumped into number one because we're going to have unevenness otherwise, right? So to keep readers oriented, I recommend limiting the number of characters that you introduce all at once, right? Like let's get to know your people well. Limit if you're doing high fantasy and there's lots of terminology and lots of world building elements, again, sprinkle them out judiciously. Avoid using multiple future plot hints all at once. That can start to feel really artificial and a little bit frustrating. We want to be here in the moment with the characters, experiencing what they're experiencing right now. And absolutely, if you're in the revision process, you can start to think about details that you've only put in there to set up book two, take them right out. We only want details that are essential for the telling of book one, which doesn't mean that we can't foreshadow. It doesn't mean we can't plant some seeds for the next book. But they also need to be highly relevant to book one. Otherwise, your reader will get frustrated. They will start to feel like these are gimmicks, right? We want to make sure that everything that's in book one is relevant to book one. This will make sure that your book is not overstuffed, and it will make sure that your readers feel well taken care of. So I talked just a second ago that we can sow seeds sometimes to set our readers up for the books that are coming next in your series. So what that might look like is dialogue seeds, offhanded comments or rumors or overheard arguments that may eventually allude to something that we read about in book two. You may have reoccurring symbols or graffiti or photo or artifacts that show up in book one and come back in the books that follow and have some sort of really meaningful significance we learn later on. And finally, consequence seeds, right? Something small happens now that becomes much more important, much more significant in the books that follow. So, for example, maybe a mysterious gun appears in book one. That's an object seed. And in book two, we learn who owned it, why it mattered. And suddenly there's this continuity between book one and book two that can be really delightful. Character planning for a series is a lot of fun and also very important. We want to think about what changes in your characters between book one and book two and book three and any other books that follow. And I would very much recommend when you are at the early stages of planning your series to just put a sentence or two about each about the characters in each of the books so that you have an idea of how they're going to evolve. Because you don't want, if let's say you're writing 5 books in a series and you know that you want your very jealous, envious character at the end to be very generous and have confidence that allows them to put aside that envy. We can't see that all of a sudden happen in book five. We want to see that journey. That's the whole joy of a series, is we want to see that character evolve more slowly so we don't feel rushed at the end to suddenly accept the evolution of your character. So depending on how significant they are in your story, you want to think about what they look like at each point of the story of the series. And so just jotting down a few notes can be really helpful. Always being aware that things can change, and that is the joy of creation. You don't have to stick to these, but it's just a map. It's a good guide to kind of help you get to the place you want to get. You want to think about what wounds or flaws are going to worsen in this character before they improve. And thinking about the relationships in their lives, the fundamental relationships in your characters' lives and how they deepen, break, shift, grow, new relationships that come into their lives. Again, this doesn't need to be perfectly planned, but if you have a sentence for each book that you're planning, that can be very helpful. So, for example, if you are writing 2 books in a series, your protagonist must learns that loyalty has a price, and in book two, she has to decide whether the price is too high. This could be an example of some challenges that you throw at your character, and you think about how they react to them at different stages of your series. World building across books is so much fun. I think that this is one of the best reasons for writing a series is because our readers love to go back to stories again and again and again and experience. I love the Louise Penny books, not so much reading them as much as hearing people talk about reading them. That's even better than reading the books because people just get so immersed in the world that Louise Penny has created, right? They love to go back to this very cozy neighborhood where lots of murder seems to happen, but so does lots of food and snowfall and cozy atmospheric stuff. So when we get to see that world across the different stories, that can be very, very comforting to your readers. So in book one, you're introducing your reader to the rules that they need to understand. Just how does this town or this planet or whatever it is you're writing about, how does it function? What are the rules? As we evolve, book two, book three, and so on, we can learn much more about the world. We will learn about new rules. We will learn about new histories of the places you're writing about. If you think about it in specific terms, you could say that book one is sort of the street level conflict, and book two reveals the political or hidden power structure behind whatever that crisis is that you're seeing in book one. So there are a couple different, I think one of the challenges of writing a series, particularly if you're doing a series that's very complicated, high fantasy tends to fall under this category best of all, we can start to forget about some of the particulars of the world that we're building. I once heard fantasy writer Tamara Pierce speak, and she had written, and this author was so prolific, and she wrote fantasy, and she talked about how her fans were actually had better memories than her, and they were starting as she got more and more successful, and her books became more and more complex, and the series grew. Her fans were starting to track discrepancies that she never in a million years would she have noticed, she said. So she started to realize people are tracking these details of my worlds more carefully than I am. And she talked about, and many writers talk about, series Bibles. And these are just documents that you keep where you are tracking characters, timelines, locations, different rules that you've set out. It could be, a character has an allergy, and, if they eat such and such a mushroom, they will have a huge reaction. Any kind of little details that you dropped in on volume one that you think you might forget about by volume seven. These are the kinds of details that you really want to have an audit of so that you don't accidentally make a faux pas that a reader would notice. A seed and payoff tracker is a great way to track some information that you'll need as well. A seed is something that you plant to connect the reader to the next book. Think about the example I gave just a minute ago about the gun, right? Maybe you start to zoom in on a gun that somebody finds in book one. Well, in book two, we need to find out why that gun was significant. Who did it belong to? Why on earth was it there? It can be very frustrating to a reader if you plant that seed and we never see the payoff. We never ever return to it. That can feel like a real um, a big plot hole. So keeping a tracker that reminds you when you've planted a seed like that will be very helpful. And then character arc trackers, just to keep track of how your characters are changing book by book, especially if you have a large cast of characters in your books. This can be very important. So I am all about the data. I'm all about keeping that information somewhere that you can glance at in a very quick way. Okay, so I have here a little revision checklist for book one. So when you have finished writing book one, you want to look for these key elements. That book one has its own contained arc and payoff, meaning that even if for some strange reason your reader doesn't go and read book two, they will have had a satisfying and complete experience reading book one because it has a clear beginning, middle, and an end, and it wraps up in a way that is satisfying. That doesn't mean it can't have a little bit of a cliffhanger, a little bit of suspense to tease us and make us want to continue, but it is a satisfying conclusion. We get what our needs are met as readers. We want to make sure that any seeds that are sown in this book, in order to entice you to read the next story or in order to connect book one with book two, we want to make sure that those seeds are supporting your current story, that they are very relevant to the here and now, even though they will become significant in book two as well. And we want to make sure that with each new book, the series arc advances slightly by the end, so that we have that continuum that gives the entire series its momentum. So the first part of my talk was really focused on writers who are writing fantasy series, right? Those really big, epic, sprawling collections where there is very complicated world building, battle scenes, lots of high drama, high stakes. When you are writing a series that is a contemporary fiction series or a literary fiction series, there are some special considerations to consider, and I want to talk about those now. We're looking at slightly different elements. The principles are similar, but we're going to get there in a slightly different way. If you're looking for a good mentor text, I'm all about mentor text, you might check out My Brilliant Friend. This is a beloved series and very good example of some of the things that we're going to talk about now. So in real-time aging and chronology matter more. So we're going to have contemporary settings where readers expect characters to age, maybe graduate, retire, get new jobs, have new relationships. We want to see those things happen in real time. That is much less important when you're writing a fantasy series. So this means you can't freeze characters the way fantasies or thrillers or maybe detective series will do. If book one takes place in 2024, book two might take place in 2026, and so on. Readers are excited to see those kind of ordinary slice of life details and see how they've impacted the characters they've come to know. Technology, culture, laws, and whatever's happening in the world at the time needs to shift in accordance to what is happening on the timeline in your book. The continuity really needs to be tighter between each book, too. Contemporary realism means that if somebody lived in a specific city in book one and had a job and a lifestyle that we came to know, and that suddenly starts to shift in book two. We need to know why. We need to know why they moved from Seattle to Philadelphia. We want to know why they're not rock climbing anymore. Like whatever it is that we really know about that character, we need to see the evolution that takes them to these new places where they arrive at in book two. Um, and also, I think this is a really fun thing to play with. Any kind of trauma or relationship scars or ways that your character's confidence was really bolstered, anything that happens like that in book one needs to leave some kind of impact on who they are in books two and three. That's really where the interesting stuff happens in this kind of a series. So if your character was divorced in book one, we want to see how that impacts their dating life in book two. We don't want to suddenly just see them all put back together because that is not as gratifying. Seeds in this case should be emotional, relational, situational. We're not fighting epic battle scenes, right? We're having these slice of life moments that everyone goes through, and we're interested in seeing how your character specifically navigates them from book one to book two. Chances are they're going to navigate them in a different way in book two than they did in book one. And the whole thing that's gratifying about the series is the fact that we've seen this transformation. In contemporary fiction, it's character relationship that is driving your series. So we're looking at friendships and familial dynamics, romantic relationships. This is what is going to be moving your story forward from book to book. So you really want to be thinking about who changes in each book, who enters or exits somebody's inner circle. We talked about trackers earlier on. This may be something that you want to put in your tracker, is kind of looking at how those relationships pivot over time. And we want to be doing a study of how tension in book one is transformed in book two. In this kind of series, the stakes are personal. It's going to affect how you really seed your future books. Instead of looking at this like a war is coming, this planet's being invaded, it's something more along the lines of my character's life is shifting. She's about to change careers, or her children are about to leave home. We're looking at evolving identity, how all of the things that you throw at your character ultimately change them. In this kind of series, place, location is very much a character. So we're going to be thinking about neighborhoods, how neighborhoods change, how workplace changes, how the friend group changes. All of these things are almost like a character in your story. And you want to think about how you are going to show these changes throughout each story. It can be one of the challenges about writing a series is you are probably writing this series over many years. It takes a really long time to write a book, right? You probably know that. And so as we change as writers, sometimes our voice can change, our narrative voice or our approach to tone can change. And that is absolutely fine if you're writing a standalone book. That's growth as an artist. One of the challenges with a series is your readers don't want to watch you change your tone and grow your voice. They want consistency. That is the joy of a series. You go there kind of knowing what to expect. So it's really important that voice and humor, the way that you express the tone of your story should be consistent. A big tonal shift in a series can feel very jarring to readers and is generally not appreciated. A tonal shift needs to be earned. It needs to be part of your character's development. So if you are planning to self-publish your series, take this information, watch it again and again, jot down notes, start tracking the key bits of information that you need to keep organized for your series, and then just go have some fun with this. I urge you not to overthink it or overcomplicate it in these early stages. If you are planning to submit your story to an agent, if you are looking for a traditional publisher, there are some things that you want to keep in mind. And I've listed some of what we hear agents say quite a bit when talking about writers who have a series to pitch. The first thing to know is that your prospective agent would love to get a great pitch for a series. They would love to have that because that makes their job so much easier, right? Typically, once readers find a series that they are invested in, they're repeat customers. So your agent likes that. Publishers like that. However, they do not want you to come to them overselling a series. Your job initially, when you prepare to query an agent, is to lead with book one, to let them know that book one on its own will be a wholly satisfying book ex reading experience for the reader. They really need that first book to be strong enough to sell on its own. They've got to pitch this to publishers. They've got to convince them this standalone book has a place on your shelves. They want to know the potential, but they do not want to be locked in to any kind of agreement with you about a full-on series. It's just too early on. So you don't want to overwhelm, you don't want to pack your query with information about future book details. Your query is there to sell that book. You may get into a conversation with that agent after you've pitched, in which you start to expound upon the potential for a series. And I'm sure many of them will be very excited to hear about that. But your query letter is all about selling this book, book one. And lastly, agents just want to know that if it gets to the point where you are pitching an entire series, that you will be open to their feedback, that you have not set this series so far ahead and that it's not so set in stone that they won't have a chance to come in and make their mark too, and perhaps take it in a slightly different direction than you may have originally foreseen it. So that's another argument for not getting too bogged down with details about your series, because an agent may come in and ask for something very different. And if that doesn't feel appealing to you, I would definitely recommend the self-publishing route. So again, publishers love series, but we just don't want to get ahead of ourselves when pitching them. So I hope this was helpful for you. If you have any questions, stick them in the comments section. I would love to hear them. I would love to answer them perhaps in the next video. And if you would like to learn more about the way that I support writers, please check out my links in the comments. I would be very grateful if this video was helpful to you, that you would hit subscribe and like, and I will have more videos just like this one every week. All right, thanks. Happy writing.